June 1934. A silent room in the Reich Chancellery. The air is heavy, thick with the smell of old paper and polished wood. Adolf Hitler stares at a single sheet of paper. It's a list of names, a death list. His pen, held in a hand that doesn't tremble, hovers over one name in particular. Ernst Röhm, his oldest friend, his first comrade, the man who still called him by the familiar du, a form of address reserved for the closest of friends. To understand the murder that created a dictatorship, we must first understand the friendship it destroyed. 12 years earlier, this betrayal would have been unthinkable. To understand why, we must go back to the wreckage of a defeated Germany, the early 1920s. The streets of Munich are a battleground of ideas, the air crackling with anger, humiliation, and desperate hope. In the smoky back rooms of beer halls, 1,000 different futures for Germany are being shouted into existence. Among the shouting men is a failed artist, a former corporal with a hypnotic stare and a furious voice, Adolf Hitler. He has a party, but it's little more than a debating club with a flag. He needs muscle. He needs an army. And then he meets Captain Ernst Röhm. Röhm is everything Hitler is not. A career soldier, a man of action, barrel-chested, his face scarred from combat. He despises the politicians who signed the armistice, the November criminals. He sees in Hitler a voice for his own rage, and Hitler sees in Röhm a builder, a man who can take the resentful, unemployed soldiers wandering the streets and forge them into a weapon. Their bond wasn't forged in a quiet office. It was forged in the chaos of street brawls, in the shared risk of an impossible revolution. Röhm took Hitler's small party guard and transformed it into the Sturmabteilung, the SA, the Stormtroopers, the brown shirts. They were his boys. They marched, they fought, they broke up the meetings of political rivals. They were the battering ram of the Nazi movement, and Röhm was the man swinging it. Imagine the scene, a packed beer hall, the air a fog of cheap cigar smoke and spilled lager. Hitler is on stage, his voice rising from a low growl to a thundering crescendo. The crowd is mesmerized, but at the back, leaning against a wall with his arms crossed, is Röhm. He isn't watching the crowd. He's watching the exits. His men are everywhere, their presence a silent promise of violence. After the speech, while others approach Hitler with reverence, Röhm slaps him on the back. "Good work, Adi," he would say, a familiarity no one else dared to use. In those moments, Hitler didn't flinch. He smiled. He needed this man, this soldier, this friend. Their loyalty was sealed in failure, the beer hall putsch of 1923. Their grand attempt to seize power in Bavaria was a disaster, ending in a hail of police bullets on the streets of Munich. 16 Nazis died. Hitler fled and was arrested later. But Röhm stood his ground. He was arrested, defiant. In their prison cells, the shared dream seemed to be over. But for them, it was just the beginning. Failure burned away the pretenders, leaving only the true believers. And no one was a truer believer than Ernst Röhm. Röhm believed in the revolution, not just a political one, but a social one. He saw the SA as more than bodyguards. They were the seed of a new German army, a people's army, loyal to the party, not to the old aristocratic generals who looked down on men like him and Hitler. This was his dream, the second revolution, and he assumed with every fiber of his being that it was Hitler's dream too. For years, They worked in tandem. Hitler was the voice. Röhm was the fist. While Hitler was in prison writing Mein Kampf, Röhm kept the shattered SA together, holding the movement's core intact. When Hitler was released, Röhm handed him back his private army, bigger and more loyal than ever. Their friendship was a strange one. Röhm was openly homosexual in an era when it was a crime, a fact his enemies would later use against him. But for years, Hitler defended him. His private life, Hitler would snap, was his own affair. He was a soldier, and that was all that mattered. It was a shield of loyalty. Röhm, in turn, offered Hitler something no one else could: unfiltered reality. He was perhaps the only man in Germany who could walk into Hitler's office unannounced and tell him he was wrong. He saw himself not as a subordinate, but as a partner in destiny. Now, we return to that silent room in 1934. The man with the pen is no longer a struggling agitator. He is the Chancellor of Germany. The beer halls have been replaced by marble halls. The street brawls by the cold machinations of state power. The revolutionary is becoming a statesman, and the statesman has new friends: industrialists who fear Röhm's socialist rhetoric, generals who fear his ambition to absorb the army into the SA. They whisper in Hitler's ear. They warn him that Röhm's 3 million stormtroopers are a threat, not to the state, but to him. Hitler looks at the name, Ernst Röhm. He must remember the shared trenches of their political war, the absolute loyalty. The man who built the ladder he used to climb to power. Was that friendship ever genuine? Or was Röhm, from the very beginning, just the most effective tool in a toolbox of ambition? A quiet knock breaks the silence. The door opens. A shadowy figure steps inside, tall, thin, wearing spectacles that catch the dim light. He moves with the quiet efficiency of a clerk, but his eyes hold no warmth. He places a single, thick manila file on the polished desk. Hitler doesn't look up. He knows who it is, and he knows what it is. The figure retreats as silently as he arrived. Hitler's gaze falls on the neatly typed label. It reads, "The Röhm problem, a problem. Not a friend, not a comrade, not the man who risked his life for him. A problem to be solved. What could be in that file to make a man consider murdering the brother he chose?" Imagine an army of 3 million men. An army larger than the national military, loyal not to the state, but to one man. This was Ernst Röhm's power, and he was about to tell the world exactly what he planned to do with it. The year is 1933. Germany has a new chancellor. But on the streets, there is no question who is in charge. It is not the police. It is not the army. The streets belong to the Sturmabteilung, the SA, the brown shirts. They are everywhere. Their heavy boots echo on the cobblestones of every city, from Berlin to Munich. By day, they march in parades that stretch for miles, a seemingly endless river of brown uniforms and swastika armbands. By night, they move through the city with torches held high, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames, casting long, dancing shadows that swallow everything. They are the party's fist. For years, they were the ones who fought the communists in the beer halls and back alleys. They broke up rival meetings, intimidated voters, and protected party leaders. They were the revolution in its rawest form, and their leader, Ernst Röhm, saw himself as the revolution's heart. He had built this force from a handful of street brawlers into a private army of millions. And now, with his old friend Adolf Hitler in the chancellery, Röhm believed their true work was about to begin. Picture a smoke-filled hall packed with the toughest SA commanders. These are not politicians. They are veterans, brawlers, men who understand violence. Röhm stands before them. He is not a polished speaker like Hitler. His voice is rough. His words are blunt. He doesn't speak of destiny or providence. He speaks of unfinished business. He tells them that putting Hitler in power was just the first step. The real enemy, he declares, is still there. They hide in their fancy offices, in their exclusive clubs. In the high command of the army, the industrialists who think they can control the party with their money. The aristocrats in the officer corps who look down on them. The common men who won the street. The SA is and remains the destiny of Germany, he proclaims. He speaks of a second revolution, a wave that will wash away the old rotten structures of the state. He promises them that the SA will not be just a political tool. It will become the new German army, a people's army, and he, Ernst Röhm, will be at its head. His men cheer. They smash their fists on the tables. For them, this is the entire point. They didn't fight and bleed to hand power over to a bunch of stuffy generals in perfectly pressed uniforms. They fought to take power for themselves. This message travels far beyond the beer hall. It reaches the ears of the German Army Command, the Reichswehr, and they are horrified. To these men, steeped in centuries of Prussian military tradition, the SA is a rabble, a disorganized mob of thugs led by a man they consider a degenerate. The idea of being absorbed into this brown-shirted horde is unthinkable. It is an insult to their honor, a threat to their very existence. In their private clubs over brandy and cigars, the generals whisper, they see Röhm not as a partner, but as a mortal enemy. They know Germany is not big enough for two armies. One of them will have to go, and they begin to quietly remind Hitler where true military power lies. It lies with them, with their training, their discipline, their artillery. Hitler is caught in the middle. He owes his power to Röhm's SA. Their loyalty is personal, fanatical. But he knows he cannot build his future on them alone. His grand plans for Germany, rearmament, conquest, war, require the expertise and industrial might that only the traditional army and the nation's business leaders can provide. He needs their factories to build tanks and planes. He needs their generals to lead his future campaigns. He cannot afford to alienate them, so he has to make a choice. And he makes it in public. In a speech to the nation, Hitler's tone changes. He speaks of order, of stability. He declares that the revolution is over. The time for street fighting has passed. The SA, he says, has done its historic duty. But now, the professional institutions of the state will take the lead. The party will guide the nation's soul, but the army will be its sole shield, its only bearer of arms. There will be no second revolution. It is a direct public rebuke of everything Röhm had just promised his men, a clear signal to the army and the industrialists that their position is safe. You would think this would be the ultimate betrayal, a friend publicly siding with your enemies. But Ernst Röhm doesn't see it that way. He hears this speech and shrugs it off. He tells his worried commanders that Adolf is just being a politician. He's saying what the old fossils need to hear. It's a clever move, a temporary tactic. In his heart, Röhm cannot believe that his oldest comrade, the man he once addressed with the familiar "du," would ever truly turn on him. He trusts the bond forged in the trenches and the beer halls. He believes that behind closed doors, nothing has changed. Their private plan, the real revolution, is still on track. This is his fatal mistake. He sees politics, but he fails to see the poison of paranoia seeping into the halls of power. He sees a friend, but fails to see a man whose fear of being overthrown is starting to outweigh any loyalty to the past. The threat Röhm posed wasn't just the size of his army. It was his vision of National Socialism, one that attacked capitalists and elites, a vision fundamentally different and perhaps more sincere than Hitler's. Hitler has just publicly sided against his best friend. Is this the first crack in their bond of loyalty? Or is it all part of a much bigger, much darker plan? While Röhm's stormtroopers were brawling in the streets, a different kind of power was growing in the shadows. It was quiet, bureaucratic, and infinitely more dangerous. It was the SS. Where the SA wore brown, these men wore black. Where the SA brandished clubs and beer steins, the SS carried clipboards and sharpened pencils. Their symbol wasn't a clenched fist, but a chilling death's head. Their motto was not about revolution. It was simple, absolute, and aimed at one man alone. My honor is loyalty. This was a new breed of political soldier, and at their head was a man who seemed utterly unremarkable. His name was Heinrich Himmler, a former chicken farmer with a weak chin and pince-nez glasses perched on his nose. He looked like a provincial clerk, the kind of man you'd barely notice. He spoke softly. He obsessed over details, the neatness of a file, the exact wording of a report, the proper cataloging of an enemy. But behind those bland eyes was a mind of chilling ambition. He didn't want to command a mob. He wanted to build an order, a fanatical priesthood of true believers, loyal only to him and through him to Adolf Hitler. In 1929, the SS, or Schutzstaffel, was little more than Hitler's personal bodyguard. A few hundred men in a movement of hundreds of thousands. They were a joke to the powerful SA commanders. But Himmler saw potential. He didn't need millions of men. He needed the right men, men who were disciplined, ideologically pure, and utterly obedient. While Röhm was building an army, Himmler was building a scalpel. And every surgeon needs a steady hand, a mind that can cut with precision and without emotion. Himmler found his in Reinhard Heydrich. If Himmler was the unassuming architect of terror, Heydrich was its star pupil. He was everything Himmler was not. Tall, blond, athletic, a skilled fencer and violinist. He was the poster boy for the Aryan ideal. But his mind was a cold labyrinth of suspicion and contempt. He trusted no one. He saw conspiracies everywhere, and he had a genius for organization. Himmler gave Heydrich a new project, a new department within the SS, known only by two letters, SD, Sicherheitsdienst, the security service. It sounded harmless, official. It was anything but. The SD was to be the party's internal intelligence agency. Its job was not to fight communists in the street. Its job was to watch everyone, especially their own. Heydrich's offices were nothing like the rowdy SA beer halls. They were silent rooms filled with the quiet scratch of pens on paper and the soft click of telephone receivers. His agents were not thugs. They were lawyers, academics, economists, men who understood that true power wasn't in breaking heads, but in knowing secrets. They began to build a web. They planted informants inside government ministries, inside factories, inside the army, and most importantly, inside the SA. Imagine the scene. An SA commander sits in his favorite bar, 3 drinks in, complaining to his trusted adjutant. He boasts about his power. He grumbles that Hitler is going soft, making deals with the old elites they were supposed to destroy. He says Röhm should be the one truly in charge. What he doesn't know is that his adjutant, his friend of 5 years, files a detailed report of the conversation with the SD the next morning. Multiply that by 1,000. Every boast, every careless word, every drunken criticism was recorded, typed up, and filed away in Heydrich's immaculate cabinets. A vast library of betrayal was being assembled, one piece of paper at a time. The SA, with its 4 million men, felt invincible. They were the heart of the movement, but a cancer was growing within them, silent and undetected. Himmler and Heydrich faced a monumental challenge. The SA wasn't just bigger than the SS, it was a giant. Röhm could summon 1 million men to a rally. Himmler could barely fill a large hall. Röhm had the affection of the party's old guard and the personal friendship of Hitler himself. Himmler had files, rumors, whispers. It wasn't enough. To topple a giant, you need more than pebbles of gossip. You need a weapon that can strike at the heart. So they decided to build one. One afternoon, Reinhard Heydrich walked into Himmler's office. He carried a single, thin folder. There was no theatricality, no grand announcement. He placed the folder on the desk with a thin, confident smile. Inside was a letter. It was typed on the official-looking letterhead of a foreign embassy in Berlin. The language was cautious, diplomatic, but the implication was explosive. It spoke of a potential change in leadership in Germany. It mentioned the need for a strong military figure to ensure stability, and it was addressed to Ernst Röhm. The letter was a complete fabrication, a masterpiece of forgery created in the quiet back rooms of the SD. Not a single word of it was true, but it looked real. It felt real. It was the first concrete piece of evidence, the first block in a carefully constructed fantasy of treason. Himmler read it, his face betraying no emotion. He understood its power immediately. This wasn't just a rumor anymore. This was a document, a tangible lie. It raises a chilling question. Who was the greater threat to Germany? The loud, violent, but ultimately predictable brutality of Röhm's Stormtroopers, or the quiet, systematic, bureaucratic evil of Himmler's SS, an evil that could conjure a man's death sentence out of ink and paper? Himmler and Heydrich now possessed their weapon, a poisoned pen letter designed to activate Hitler's deepest, most consuming fear, betrayal by those closest to him. But the gap between their shadowy office and the Reich Chancellery was immense. Ernst Röhm wasn't just some party official. He was the only man who could call Hitler by the familiar du. He was a comrade from the very beginning. To accuse him was to accuse a brother. They had the evidence. But how could two relatively minor figures convince the leader of Germany to turn on the most powerful man in his party? The first drop of poison had been mixed. The question was how to make the Führer drink it. The German army had a choice: be swallowed by Ernst Röhm's revolutionary mob or make a deal with the devil. Their decision would seal the fate of the Republic, and it would unleash a monster they could never control. By the spring of 1934, Germany was a nation with two armies. One was the Reichswehr, the official military. It was a force of 100,000 men, a number dictated by the treaties that ended the Great War. It was professional, disciplined, and steeped in centuries of Prussian tradition. Its generals were aristocrats who saw themselves as the guardians of the state, the final line of defense against chaos. And chaos had a name: Ernst Röhm. Röhm's army, the SA, was the Second Army. It was a sprawling, undisciplined beast of nearly 3 million men. They were the street fighters, the brawlers, the true believers who had carried the Nazi Party to power on a wave of violence and intimidation. They answered to Röhm, and Röhm answered to a vision of a second revolution. A revolution that would sweep away the old elites, the industrialists, the bankers, and most importantly, the generals of the Reichswehr. The generals were terrified. They heard Röhm's speeches and saw his legions marching through the streets. They knew his ambition was to merge the Reichswehr into his SA, creating a new People's Army, with himself at its head. For the old guard, this was more than a threat to their jobs. It was a threat to their world, to their very identity. The polished boots of the officer corps would be replaced by the muddy jackboots of the Stormtrooper. It was a humiliation they would not endure. For months, they sent warnings to the new Chancellor, Adolf Hitler. They used back channels, sent quiet emissaries appealing to his sense of order, his need for a professional military to achieve his future goals. But Hitler did nothing. He wavered. He delayed. Röhm was his oldest comrade, the man who stood by him in the earliest, darkest days, the only man who still called him Adolf instead of Mein Führer. To move against Röhm felt like cutting off a limb. But the army's patience was running out, and they had one final, decisive card to play: Paul von Hindenburg. The 86-year-old president of Germany was a living relic of the old empire, a field marshal who commanded immense respect. Hindenburg was the only man in Germany whose power rivaled Hitler's. He was old and frail, but he was still the head of state and supreme commander of the armed forces. And he despised the SA, viewing them as a brown plague. The moment of decision came in late May. The setting was not some smoky back room, but the pristine deck of the cruiser Deutschland, slicing through the Baltic Sea. Hitler was there, with the Minister of Defense, General Werner von Blomberg. The air was crisp, the sea was calm, but the conversation was a storm. Blomberg, speaking for the entire officer corps and with the full backing of President Hindenburg, delivered the ultimatum. It was simple and brutal. Either Hitler dealt with Ernst Röhm and his ambitions, or the army would. They would persuade Hindenburg to declare martial law, the Reichswehr would take control of the country, and the Nazi government would be swept aside. Imagine the scene. Hitler, the master of mass rallies, the man who could sway millions with his voice, is now cornered. He is on a ship surrounded by the cold, gray steel of the Navy and the even colder resolve of its generals. He has no cheering crowds here, no loyal stormtroopers to protect him, just a handful of men in immaculate uniforms, calmly explaining how they will destroy him if he doesn't comply. He looks at their faces. He sees no room for negotiation. This is not a request. It is a command. The choice was finally laid bare. On one side was loyalty, friendship, the revolutionary past that brought him to power. Ernst Röhm represented all of that. On the other side was the future, his plans for rearmament, for conquest, for a 1,000-year Reich. None of it was possible without the army. They were the only institution with the organization, expertise, and tradition to wage the wars he dreamed of. He had to choose between his brother and his crown. For Adolf Hitler, it was never really a choice at all. He didn't argue, he didn't protest. He looked at General Blomberg, his face a mask of calm resolve, and made a promise. He didn't just agree to curb Röhm's power or vow to shrink the SA. He went further, much further. He told the generals that he understood the problem completely. He would not just discipline the SA leadership. He would eliminate it. He would cut out the cancer once and for all. He spoke of a ruthless and bloody reckoning. The generals were stunned. They had come prepared for a fight, for a negotiation. They expected Hitler to defend his old friend. Instead, he had offered them everything they wanted and more. They were relieved, triumphant. They believed they had done it. They had tamed the radical, put a leash on the street fighter from Vienna. They thought they had bent Adolf Hitler to their will. And so, the devil's bargain was struck. In exchange for Hitler's promise to annihilate the SA leadership, the army made a promise of its own. President Hindenburg was dying. When he was gone, the army would support Hitler to succeed him. They would stand aside and allow him to merge the offices of Chancellor and President, making him the undisputed, absolute head of the German state. They thought they were simply securing their own survival. In reality, they were handing one man total, unchecked power. They thought they were using Hitler, a vulgar but necessary tool to solve their Röhm problem. Perhaps it was naivety. Perhaps these men of honor and tradition truly didn't understand the force they were endorsing. Or perhaps it was something darker, a quiet complicity, a willingness to look the other way while a tyrant cleaned house, so long as their own institution remained untouched. They saw a chance to remove a rival, and they took it, without considering the price the entire world would pay. Hitler left the meeting with a new, terrible certainty. The path was clear. The army was his. The future was his. All it would cost was the life of his friend. The deal was done. The promise was made, but a promise is just words. Now he had to act. He had to give the order that would unleash Himmler's black-shirted executioners. How do you convince a man to kill his brother? You don't use logic. You use fear. You plant a seed of doubt and let his own paranoia do the rest. For Adolf Hitler, that paranoia was a garden waiting for a seed, and Heinrich Himmler was a patient gardener. The army's ultimatum hung in the air of the Reich Chancellery. It was a cold, unspoken threat that followed Hitler from room to room. Deal with the SA, or we will. The old guard, the men with aristocratic names and long military pedigrees, had drawn their line. On one side stood the German state, the army, and President Hindenburg. On the other, Ernst Röhm and his 4 million stormtroopers. Hitler was trapped in the middle. He was the Chancellor, the Führer, but he was not yet the absolute master of Germany. This was the moment Himmler and Hermann Göring had been waiting for. They moved not with force, but with whispers. They were a study in contrasts. Göring, the flamboyant air ace, draped in medals and oozing false bonhomie. Himmler, the quiet, almost invisible administrator, with his pince-nez glasses and meticulous files. They began to visit Hitler more frequently. Their meetings were never on the official schedule. They happened late at night, in the quiet of his private study. Their approach was masterful in its subtlety. They began with concern. "Mein Führer," Göring would say, his voice a low rumble, "we are worried. The men of the SA, they talk too much. They drink too much." Himmler would nod in agreement, a silent shadow at Göring's side. They brought reports, transcripts from spies inside SA barracks, tales of drunken commanders boasting about the coming Second Revolution. They spoke of how Röhm was the true power in Germany, how the stormtroopers were loyal to him and only him. At first, Hitler pushed back. He would wave a dismissive hand. "Ernst is a soldier. He speaks bluntly. He has always been this way." He reminded them of the early days, of the beer hall putsch, of the loyalty forged in street fights and prison cells. "Röhm is my oldest friend. He is the only one I allow to call me Adolf." This bond, this history, was the fortress Himmler and Göring had to breach. So they changed tactics. They stopped attacking Röhm's loyalty directly. Instead, they painted him as a liability, a man whose ambition was out of control, making powerful enemies Hitler could not afford. They brought him the Army's intelligence reports, highlighting the general's growing alarm. They reminded him that President Hindenburg was old, frail, and listening to the Army. If Hindenburg died, the Army could refuse to back Hitler as his successor. The entire Nazi dream would collapse. Imagine the scene, a vast, lonely office in the heart of Berlin. The only light is a single desk lamp. Hitler sits hunched over, his face pale in the glow. Himmler stands before him, placing a thin file on the polished wood. "A new report, mein Führer." Inside is a letter, allegedly from Röhm to a foreign diplomat. The language is careless, arrogant. It speaks of the Army as a relic, a fossil to be swept away. The letter is, of course, a complete forgery, crafted in the workshops of Reinhard Heydrich's intelligence service, but it looks real. The signature is perfect. Hitler reads it, then reads it again, his knuckles white as he grips the paper. This wasn't a drunken boast. This was a calculated political move, a betrayal. Still, he hesitates. He demands more proof. He wants to believe in his friend, to believe that 2 decades of comradeship still means something. His loyalty was the last shield Röhm had, and it was beginning to crack. This is when Reinhard Heydrich, Himmler's brilliant and utterly ruthless deputy, played his master card. He understood something fundamental about Hitler. His ego was as vast as his ambition, and he was terrified of looking weak on the world stage. Heydrich didn't bring another forged letter to Hitler. He went to the foreign press. through quiet, deniable channels. His agents leaked a sensational story. They told journalists in Paris and London that a massive power struggle was brewing in Germany, that the head of the powerful SA, Ernst Röhm, was preparing to launch a coup d'etat against Adolf Hitler. The story was an explosive scoop, exactly what the world wanted to hear about the chaotic new regime in Germany. Within days, the headlines were printed: Hitler's regime on brink of civil war. Stormtrooper chief plots takeover. Then Himmler returned to Hitler's office. He didn't carry a secret file this time. He carried a stack of international newspapers. He laid them out on the desk one by one. The bold black headlines screamed from the page. "You see, mein Führer," Himmler said, his voice barely a whisper. "It is no longer a secret. The entire world knows of Röhm's treason. He has made us look weak. He has humiliated Germany." This was the blow from which Röhm's shield could not recover. It was no longer about one man's word against another's. It was now a public fact. To deny it was to admit that he, Adolf Hitler, had lost control of his own movement. To hesitate was to invite the army to step in and restore order. The fabricated story had created its own reality. It's impossible to know the exact moment Hitler stopped being manipulated and became a willing participant. Was it the forged letter? The sting of public humiliation from those headlines? Whatever the trigger, the poison had done its work. The seed of doubt had grown into a tree of certainty. He began to look back on every blunt statement Röhm had ever made, every arrogant boast, every demand for more power. He replayed them in his mind, filtered through the new lens of betrayal. The whispers had become his own thoughts. He retreated into himself. For days he was seen by almost no one. He paced his rooms, his mind a whirlwind of suspicion and rage. The army had given him an ultimatum. His rivals had given him the justification. The world press had given him the public excuse. Every voice around him, every piece of paper placed in front of him, told the same story. His friend, his brother in arms, the man who had stood by him from the very beginning, was now his greatest enemy. Imagine your friends are warning you. They're telling you you're in mortal danger, begging you to flee the country, to hide, to do anything. But you just laugh. You laugh because the man they say wants to kill you is your closest, most trusted friend, your brother in arms. This was Ernst Röhm's fatal mistake. By early June of 1934, the air in Berlin was thick with more than just summer heat. It was thick with conspiracy. The whispers that began in the polished halls of SS headquarters had become a low roar, audible to anyone who cared to listen. Messages began to find their way to Ernst Röhm, coming from old government contacts, sympathetic officials, even foreign diplomats. The warnings were all the same. Lists are being drawn up. Your name is at the top. The SS are sharpening their knives. The army has canceled all leave. Röhm's sprawling headquarters was a fortress of brown shirt power. Maps covered the walls, telephones rang constantly, and the air smelled of cigar smoke and brandy. Into this den came an old conservative politician, a man who despised the Nazis, but feared civil war even more. He'd managed to get a private meeting, and he laid out the threat plainly. Himmler and Göring were moving against him. They had convinced the Führer he was planning a coup. They had a dossier. They claimed he planned to murder Hitler. Röhm leaned back in his heavy oak chair, took a long drag from his cigar, and blew a perfect smoke ring. Then he laughed, not a chuckle, but a deep, booming laugh that filled the room. He clapped the politician on the back hard enough to make him stumble. "My dear friend," Röhm bellowed, "you worry too much. A coup against Adolf? I made Adolf. The SA made Adolf. He would be nothing without us." He dismissed the man with a wave of his hand, as if swatting away a fly. The warnings kept coming. An anonymous note left on his car. A frantic late-night call from a low-level Army intelligence officer who had seen troop movement orders. Each time, the reaction was the same: denial, arrogance, and unshakable faith in a bond forged more than a decade earlier. To his anxious commanders, who were hearing the same rumors, he was a picture of confidence. "Himmler," he'd sneer, "that scheming little chicken farmer, and fat Göring. He's too busy designing new uniforms to be a threat." His entire worldview was built on a simple, powerful idea. He and Hitler were the twin pillars of the revolution. He was the fist. Hitler was the voice. He saw himself not as a subordinate, but as a partner. How could Adolf betray his own partner? How could he cut off the very arm that had carried him to power? Röhm couldn't see that the game had changed. Hitler was no longer a revolutionary trying to seize power. He was a chancellor trying to consolidate it. And Röhm, with his 4 million angry stormtroopers demanding a second revolution, was no longer an asset. He was a liability. The final, most desperate warning came from his own deputy. He begged Röhm to put the SA on full alert, to make a show of force, to prove they couldn't be pushed aside. He laid out the evidence. The SS were stockpiling weapons. Key SA leaders were being followed. Their phones were tapped. Röhm listened, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed the message might be getting through. He stood and walked to the window, looking down at the streets of Berlin. Then he turned, a faint smile on his lips. "Don't be hysterical," he said. "Adolf stands by me. Adolf will always stand by me." Then the phone rang. The call came directly from the Reich Chancellery. The room fell silent. It was Hitler. Röhm's posture changed. He stood straighter, his boisterous tone replaced by one of genuine respect. "Yes, my Führer." He listened intently, nodding, as a slow smile of pure vindication spread across his face. "Of course, Adolf. An excellent idea. We are all overworked. Yes, I will see to it immediately." He hung up and turned to face his worried staff, his face beaming with triumph. "You see?" he announced. "What did I tell you? All these rumors, all this poison, it's nonsense." The voice on the other end of the line had been calm, friendly, even warm, the voice of his old comrade. Hitler had told him he was aware of the vicious rumors being spread by reactionary elements to drive a wedge between them. He assured Röhm of his complete and total trust. And then he made an offer, a peace offering. The entire leadership of the SA was exhausted, he said. They had fought for years and deserved a rest. He suggested that Röhm and all his senior commanders take a month-long paid holiday, starting at the end of June. They were all to gather at a lakeside spa hotel in a quiet town called Bad Wiessee. A chance to relax, clear their heads, and prepare for the next glorious chapter of the Reich. To Röhm, this was the ultimate victory. It wasn't a trap. It was a reward. It was Hitler's way of telling the Army and the SS to back off, a reaffirmation of their bond. He had faced down the whispers and won. His faith had been rewarded. His friend was still his friend. Was it loyalty? A blind faith in a friendship that had survived street brawls and prison cells? Or was it pure arrogance, the fatal pride of a man who believed he was too essential to be cast aside? Perhaps it was both. As the SA commanders received the news, a wave of relief washed over them. They started packing their bags for a summer holiday, heading for the sunshine and the calm waters of the Tegernsee. Hundreds of the most powerful men in the Nazi Party, the entire command structure of a 4-million-man army, all preparing to gather in one isolated hotel. A generous offer from a loyal friend? Or the perfect kill box, baited and ready to be sprung? The code word was Hummingbird. It wasn't the plan for a battle. It was the blueprint for a nationwide synchronized political massacre. And the men drawing it up were doing so with the cold efficiency of accountants. In the sterile, brightly lit offices of SS headquarters on Prince Albrecht Strasser, the air was thick with the smell of paper and quiet ambition. This was Reinhard Heydrich's domain, a world of filing cabinets, typewriters, and meticulously organized charts. Here, murder was not an act of passion. It was a problem of logistics. Heydrich, the architect of the operation, moved between desks with a chilling calm. Tall, blond, with eyes that never seemed to blink, he oversaw teams working in shifts, their faces pale under the electric lights. They weren't sharpening knives. They were cross-referencing names, addresses, and schedules. They were building a database of death. On the central table, lists were being finalized. These were not just the names of SA Stormtroopers. The purge was becoming an opportunity, a chance to settle old scores and erase inconvenient truths. A slender finger would point to a name: Kurt von Schleicher, the former chancellor who thought he could outmaneuver the Führer. A fatal miscalculation. Another name: Edgar Jung, the conservative speechwriter whose ideas had become a liability. With each scratch of the pen, a life was condemned. Gregor Strasser, a rival from the party's early days. Gustav Ritter von Kahr, the man who crushed the beer hall putsch a decade earlier. Old grievances were being settled with bureaucratic finality. Heydrich was serving revenge on an industrial scale. But this cold bureaucratic terror in Berlin was only one part of the machine. Miles away, at his opulent estate, Hall, the second most powerful man in Germany was preparing his own list. Hermann Göring's approach was different. He sat not in a sterile office, but in a vast hall decorated with medieval tapestries and stolen art, dressed in a silk robe with a plate of rich pastries at his elbow. While Heydrich eliminated ideological threats, Göring was eliminating business rivals and personal enemies. He reviewed his list with a satisfied smirk, adding the name of a banker who had refused him a loan, or a critic who had panned his wife's acting. For Göring, Operation Hummingbird was a state-sanctioned chance to get rich and get even. The SS list in Munich was for the revolution. Göring's list was for himself. This wasn't one operation. It was a swarm of personal vendettas, all hiding under the wing of a single code word. The operation needed more than lists. It needed guns. And the SS, still a relatively small organization, did not have enough. For that, they turned to the one institution that feared the SA more than anyone, the German Army. In a dimly lit office at the Ministry of Defense, a secret meeting took place. An SS colonel, severe in his black uniform, stood before a Wehrmacht general. The general, a man of the old Prussian aristocracy, looked down on the SS officer with a disdain mixed with necessity. There were no pleasantries. The SS man's question was direct. Was the transport and equipment prepared? The general nodded, tapping a set of keys on his polished desk. The armories at the Lichterfelde barracks would be open to the SS after midnight. The guards had been reassigned. His only condition, delivered with a flicker of grim satisfaction, was that they clean out the rabble with some discipline. The keys slid across the desk. A pact was sealed. The army, the supposed guardian of the German state, was now actively arming a death squad. With the plan solidified, the secret had to be kept. But a secret this large is a fragile thing. In a small telegraph office in a Munich suburb, a young, observant SA trooper named Klaus worked the late shift. For 2 nights, he'd noticed a series of short, repetitive coded messages on a secure SS channel. They all contained one unusual word: colibri, hummingbird. It meant nothing to him, but the frequency and secrecy felt wrong. He called the local SA headquarters and got a mid-level commander on the line, a man known more for his drinking than his thinking. Klaus explained what he'd seen. The commander laughed it off. The SS were just Heinrich's little toy soldiers playing with their code words. When Klaus insisted, pointing to the sheer volume of traffic, the commander cut him off. Adolf stood by Röhm, and Röhm stood by them. He told Klaus to stop wasting his time and get back to work. The line went dead. The final warning had been given, and it had been laughed away. The window of escape had just slammed shut. The meticulous planning of the SS did not mean the operation would be flawless. It would be brutal, and it would be messy. This messiness revealed a deeper, more horrifying truth. The lists, for all their bureaucratic precision, were still just names on a page, and the men sent to do the killing were not surgeons, they were butchers. In a quiet Munich apartment, the music critic Willy Schmid was practicing the cello, while his wife put their children to bed. Suddenly, the door splintered, kicked in by heavy boots. 4 men in black SS uniforms stormed into the living room. They shouted his name. He stood, confused, confirming his identity as the cello bow clattered to the floor. Before his wife could scream, they dragged him away. Her pleas and questions about what he had done were met with silence. They threw him into a car and drove off. He was executed hours later, his body dumped in a forest. The next day, a senior SS officer realized the mistake. The man on the list was Willy Schmidt with a T, a local SA leader who lived 3 blocks away. A basket of fruit and a formal apology were sent to the widow by Rudolf Hess himself. An apology for a clerical error. But imagine that for a moment. Does that mistake show the purge was chaotic, a clumsy bloodbath run by amateurs? Or does it reveal something far more sinister, that the regime had reached a point of such absolute power and such profound indifference to human life that the specific identity of the victim simply didn't matter anymore? A name on a list was a name on a list, and a body was just a body. The lists are now finalized. The execution squads are briefed. The army has unlocked the armories, turning its back as the wolves are let into the sheepfold. Across Germany, the SA sleeps, blissfully ignorant, convinced of their leader's friendship and their own untouchable power. The entire nation is a loaded gun, with a trembling finger on the trigger. The trap is set. All that was needed now was the final signal, a single phone call from the one man who still hesitated to kill his oldest friend. On the eve of the bloodiest purge in his nation's history, Adolf Hitler was smiling. He was the guest of honor at a wedding, playing the part of a benevolent leader, while his executioners waited for his call. The day was June 29th, 1934. The place was Essen, a city of steel and industry, and the event was the wedding of Josef Terboven, a loyal Nazi party chief. The air was filled with the sound of champagne glasses clinking, of polite laughter, of a string quartet playing softly in the background. At the center of it all stood the Führer, a picture of calm and cordiality. He shook the groom's hand. He complimented the bride. He moved through the crowd of high society guests with an easy grace, a man completely at peace with his world. It was a masterful performance. Every smile, every handshake, every pleasantry was a carefully constructed piece of an alibi. He needed to be here. He needed witnesses to see him hundreds of miles away from the coming storm. While Hitler toasted the happy couple, other men were not celebrating. Across Germany, the gears of a hidden machine were turning. Near the tranquil shores of a Bavarian lake, outside the small resort town of Bad Wiessee, units of the SS were disembarking from army trucks. They didn't wear their telltale black uniforms. Dressed as soldiers of the regular army, their movements were quiet, precise, and sinister as they melted into the woods surrounding a hotel, the Pension Hanselbauer. Inside that hotel, Ernst Röhm and the leadership of the SA were sleeping, enjoying a lakeside holiday, ordered by Hitler himself. They had no idea they were being surrounded. They had no idea the forest was filling up with men who had their names on a list. In Berlin, in the cold, bureaucratic offices of the SS, Heinrich Himmler sat by a telephone. He had been sitting there for hours. Before him lay the lists compiled by his deputy, Reinhard Heydrich, lists of names, not just SA leaders, but old political rivals, troublesome conservatives, journalists who had asked too many questions. Even a predecessor of Hitler's, a former chancellor. It was a catalogue of resentments, a ledger of old scores to be settled in blood. All Himmler needed was the code word, the final authorization, the call from the wedding. But the call did not come. Hour after hour, Hitler remained at the reception. He chatted about architecture. He listened to a local industrialist complain about unions. He ate cake. To the outside world, he was simply a leader enjoying a rare moment of relaxation. But those who watched him closely saw something else. They saw the slight tremor in his hand as he raised a glass. They saw the way his eyes would glaze over, looking at something far beyond the ballroom walls. They saw a man stretched to his absolute breaking point. He was about to betray and murder the man who had been his closest comrade for over a decade. The man who was the only one left who still called him by his first name. Then, late in the evening, it happened. The performance reached its climax. An aide hurried through the crowd, his face a mask of rehearsed panic. He leaned in and whispered into Hitler's ear, "An urgent telephone call from Berlin." Hitler excused himself, stepping into an adjacent room, but leaving the door strategically ajar. The guests fell silent, watching the silhouette of their leader. They could hear his voice, at first low and questioning, then rising in shock and fury. He burst back into the ballroom. The friendly, smiling guest was gone. In his place was a specter of pure rage. His face was pale, his eyes blazing. "Treason!" he roared, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Mutiny!" He told the stunned guests that he had just received word from Himmler. Röhm's stormtroopers in Berlin had been called to the streets. A putsch was underway. The traitors had finally shown their hand. It was, of course, a complete fabrication. There was no putsch in Berlin. The SA men were in their barracks, just as confused as everyone else. The phone call was theater. The panic was an act. The outrage was a lie. It was the prearranged signal Himmler had been waiting for. The fictional crisis that would serve as the public justification for the real slaughter about to begin. Hitler had his excuse. He had his audience of shocked, reliable witnesses. This level of deception is chilling. What is more terrifying? A leader consumed by blind, fanatical hatred, or one who can summon and dismiss that rage at will? A man who can toast a bride in one moment and sign a death warrant in the next, with the same calculated calm. The fanatic is a force of nature, but the actor is something far more dangerous, because you never see him coming. Hitler didn't wait for goodbyes. He stormed out of the wedding hall, his inner circle scrambling to keep up. The mask of the benevolent leader was gone, replaced by the mask of the avenging Führer. He was driven to a nearby airfield where his personal transport plane, a 3-engine Junkers, was waiting with its engines already running. He climbed the steps without a backward glance. The doors closed, sealing him inside. The plane climbed into the pre-dawn blackness, a silver shark cutting through the night sky. On board, Adolf Hitler was no longer acting. He was flying towards Munich. He was flying towards a lakeside hotel. He was flying towards a personal confrontation with the man who still called him Adolf, the friend he was about to murder. The air over Lake Tegernsee was cool and still. 4:30 in the morning. Inside the Hotel Hanselbauer, the leaders of the SA slept off a night of drink and easy laughter, convinced of their own power. A knock came at one of the doors, soft, polite. Maybe the morning paper or an early breakfast. It was their Führer, and he had brought a firing squad. Just 2 hours earlier, the night sky over Munich had been torn open by the sound of a Junkers Ju-52 aircraft. It descended through the darkness, landing at the Oberwiesenfeld airfield. The door opened, and Adolf Hitler stepped out. He wasn't wearing the uniform of a chancellor. His face was pale in the pre-dawn gloom, his trench coat pulled tight against the chill. He looked less like a head of state and more like a mob boss arriving to settle a score. Waiting on the tarmac were the SS, Hitler's personal guard. Sepp Dietrich stood at attention, his Leibstandarte commandos arrayed behind him. They were the elite, armed with pistols and submachine guns. Their faces were grim, disciplined, ready. Hitler gave a sharp nod, the only command necessary. A convoy of dark Mercedes cars was waiting, engines already running. Hitler climbed into the front passenger seat of the lead car. This was not a task to be delegated. He had to be there, to see it with his own eyes. Imagine that drive, a line of black cars slicing through the sleeping Bavarian countryside. What was going through his mind? Was this the cold calculation of a politician removing a threat, or the hot-blooded satisfaction of a man about to destroy a friend he believed had betrayed him? The answer was probably both, and that is what made it so terrifying. The convoy arrived at Bad Wiessee as the first hint of gray light touched the sky. The cars pulled up to the Hotel Hanselbauer without their headlights on, gliding to a silent stop. SS men poured out, moving with practiced efficiency. They surrounded the building. There was no shouted warning, no demand for surrender, only the sound of heavy boots on gravel and then the splintering crack of the hotel's main door being forced open. The raid was a display of swift, brutal efficiency. Doors were kicked in. SA leaders, men who commanded millions, were dragged from their beds. Half-dressed, dazed, their minds thick with sleep and alcohol, they stared into the harsh beams of flashlights. They saw the black uniforms, the guns pointed at their chests. They saw the face of Sepp Dietrich and the face of their Führer, and they understood nothing. Hitler stalked from room to room, his voice a guttural roar in the quiet hallways. He found Edmund Heines, a high-ranking SA commander, in a room with a young man. The sight seemed to break something inside Hitler. He began to scream about perversion, about betrayal, about the moral filth that had infested his movement. Heines, a powerful man just moments before, stood there, utterly bewildered. He tried to speak, to ask what was happening. Hitler didn't listen. He turned to his guards, pointed at Heines, and gave a simple, brutal order. Take him outside and shoot him. Then he walked down the hall to room number 7, Ernst Röhm's room. This was the moment the entire operation had been built around, the final terrible meeting between the two men who had started this journey together in the beer halls of Munich over a decade ago, the revolutionary and his loyal bulldog. Hitler pushed the door open himself. Röhm was just waking up, disturbed by the commotion. He sat up in bed and saw Adolf Hitler standing in his doorway flanked by SS guards. He must have braced himself for the explosion, for the accusations, the trial by shouting match, the final bitter argument between two old comrades. He got silence. Hitler just stared at him. There was no rage left in his eyes, only a look of flat, cold contempt. The look you give something you're about to discard. He didn't say Röhm's name. He didn't speak of their long friendship or the revolution they had built. He said nothing at all. He simply looked past him at the SS men and gave a slight jerk of his head. "Arrest him," he said, his voice barely a whisper, and then he turned and walked away. The silence was more damning than any scream. It meant Röhm was no longer a rival to be fought. He was just a problem to be solved. The sun was rising now, casting a beautiful, peaceful light over the lake, a light that revealed a scene from a nightmare. The most feared men of the SA, the kings of the street, were being herded like cattle. Their hands were bound. Their faces were masks of shock and disbelief. They were pushed onto buses, their grand revolution ending not with a bang, but with the quiet click of a bus door closing. Ernst Röhm was driven away, separated from the others. He was a prisoner. His power was gone. His army was being decapitated across the country. But he was still alive. For now. Did Adolf Hitler, the man he called his friend, still intend to spare his life? While Hitler was arresting his friends in Bavaria, Hermann Göring was in Berlin with a list of his own. His targets weren't just stormtroopers. They were rivals, critics, and ghosts from the past. The purge was about to become a bloodbath. The morning of June 30th, 1934, was quiet in Berlin. Deceptively so. While Hitler played the role of the betrayed friend in the mountains, Göring played the role of the state's protector in the capital. He sat in his vast office at the Prussian State Ministry, surrounded by phones, maps, and lists. He was a spider at the center of a web, waiting for a single word. The call came just after dawn. The connection was clear, the voice from Munich brief. The code word was Hummingbird. Göring hung up the phone, a thin smile on his lips. For him, this was never just about Ernst Röhm. This was an opportunity, a chance to wipe the board clean. He turned to his adjutants and gave the order. The second front of the purge was now open. The first targets were not SA men. They were men of the old world who represented a Germany that was dying. General Kurt von Schleicher was one of them, a former Chancellor of Germany, a man of influence and military pedigree. He had underestimated Hitler, thinking politics was a gentleman's game. He was about to learn a terrible lesson. A black car pulled up to his villa in a quiet suburb. A squad of SS men, not in uniform, walked to the door. They didn't knock. They rang the bell. When Schleicher answered, they pushed inside. His wife Elizabeth ran into the hallway. There were shouts. Schleicher recognized one of the men and tried to reason with them. But there was no reasoning, only orders. The neighbors heard the shots, a short, brutal burst of gunfire. When the police finally arrived, they found the general dead in his study. His wife lay in the doorway, killed as she tried to shield him with her body. The official story claimed Schleicher had resisted arrest, reaching for a pistol. It was a lie. He was executed in cold blood. The old Germany was being murdered in its own home. The next name on the list was just as personal, Gregor Strasser. This was a different kind of ghost, not from the old regime, but from within the Nazi Party itself. Strasser had once been Hitler's rival, a powerful figure in the North, a socialist voice within the movement. He had challenged Hitler's leadership years ago and lost. He had since retired from politics, believing he was safe. He was wrong. The Gestapo came for him at his home. There was no struggle. He was taken quietly. Driven to the Gestapo headquarters on Prince Albrecht Strasse, he was thrown into a cell. Strasser probably thought he would be questioned, interrogated. He waited. Hours passed. Then a small hatch in his cell door opened. He saw the barrel of a pistol. The shot echoed in the concrete basement. He didn't die instantly. He lay on the floor, bleeding for hours while guards were ordered not to help him. His death was slow, deliberate, cruel. It was a message to anyone inside the party. Loyalty was absolute. Dissent was a death sentence. The purge was spreading, moving beyond soldiers and politicians to target ideas themselves. Erich Klausner was a devout Catholic, a senior official in the Ministry of Transport. He had recently given a speech defending religious freedom, a speech that angered the new regime. He was not a threat to the state. He was a threat to its ideology. That same Saturday morning, Klausner was working in his office when two SS officers walked in. They didn't say a word. They drew their pistols and shot him at his desk. It happened in a government building in broad daylight. A man murdered for his convictions. The rule of law wasn't just being bent, it was being shattered. But in the chaos, mistakes were made. Terrible, fatal mistakes. An SS squad had a name on their list, Willy Schmid. They were told he was a conspirator and given an address in a Munich suburb. They stormed the apartment. Inside, they found a man with his wife and children. The man was terrified. He tried to explain his name was Willy Schmid. Yes, but he was a music critic, a writer. He had nothing to do with politics. His family pleaded, screamed, begged the SS to check their orders. But the men had their instructions, a name, an address. They dragged the music critic into another room. His wife heard the argument, then the shots. They left his body on the floor and walked out. Later, the mistake was discovered. The actual target, an SA leader named Wilhelm Schmid, was found and killed elsewhere. But what about the dead music critic? The cover-up was immediate. Himmler's deputy, Reinhard Heydrich, personally saw to it that the body was returned to the family in a sealed coffin. They were forbidden to open it. They were given a death certificate listing the cause as suicide and warned, under threat of death, to never speak of what happened. Think about what that means. The machine of death was now so indiscriminate, so drunk on power, that it could murder an innocent man by mistake and simply erase the crime. The life of a music critic, a husband, a father, was worth less than the inconvenience of admitting an error. The Röhm putsch was the excuse, the great lie that covered a multitude of sins. Hitler claimed he was saving Germany from a coup. But the men being shot in Berlin and across the country had nothing to do with Röhm's ambitions. They were old enemies, political rivals, men who knew too much, or men who simply believed in the wrong things. This was a nationwide settling of scores, carried out under the fog of a manufactured crisis, and the German people, fed a story of treason and betrayal, accepted it. They heard the news on the radio, read it in the papers, and believed their leader had saved them. But the killing wasn't over. The lists were long. The execution squads were still roaming the streets. The violence had taken on a life of its own, a bloody feedback loop of paranoia and revenge, with generals, politicians, and even music critics being gunned down. A terrifying question hung in the air of the new Germany. If these men were not safe, who was? Locked in a prison cell, Ernst Röhm waited. He had been arrested by his best friend Adolf Hitler, but he still believed that friend would come and save him. He was about to learn the final, brutal lesson about power, a lesson always paid for in blood. The cell in Stadelheim prison was cold. It was a world away from the luxury of the Hanselbauer Hotel, from the cheering crowds and the endless banquets. Here there was only damp stone, a single barred window high on the wall, and a heavy, suffocating silence. Röhm paced the small space, his boots echoing faintly. This had to be a mistake, a terrible misunderstanding. He had been Hitler's first true believer, his most loyal brawler. He had built the SA from nothing, turning street fighters into an army of millions. Adolf would never do this to him, not to his Ernst. He told himself it was Himmler's work, or Göring's. Those two were always whispering in Hitler's ear, dripping poison. They were jealous of his power, of his closeness to the Führer. They had staged this, fabricated evidence, created a crisis to force Hitler's hand. Soon, Adolf would see through their lies. He would come bursting through that door, furious at the insult to his oldest comrade. He would apologize. And then there would be hell to pay for the men in black uniforms. Röhm held on to that thought. It was the only thing keeping the cold from seeping into his bones. Then he heard it, a sharp crack, echoing from the courtyard outside. Then another and another, a volley of rifle fire. Röhm stopped pacing. He stood perfectly still, listening. What was that? A training exercise, an execution. He pressed his ear against the thick wooden door. For a few minutes, there was only silence. Then a voice shouted a name he couldn't quite make out. It was followed by another sharp volley of shots. This pattern continued. A pause, a shouted name, a rip of gunfire. The sounds were methodical, organized. This was not random violence. This was a process. And the names, he started to recognize them. August Schneidhuber, Wilhelm Schmid, Hans Heyn. These were his men, his commanders, the very men who had been laughing and drinking with him just yesterday. They were being shot one by one without a trial, without a charge. The truth began to dawn on him, a monstrous, unthinkable reality. This wasn't Himmler's private war. This was ordered from the very top. The disbelief curdled into rage. He hammered his fists against the cell door. "Guard! Guard! What is happening out there? Let me out! The Führer needs to hear from me!" His voice, which had commanded millions, now echoed uselessly in his tiny stone box. No one answered. The only reply was another volley of shots from the courtyard. The sound of his army being dismantled, bullet by bullet. His entire world was being executed just a few dozen meters away, and he could do nothing but listen. He slumped onto the hard cot, his mind racing. He saw Hitler's face from that morning at the hotel. The screaming rage, the accusations of treason. It hadn't seemed real then. It felt like a performance for the SS men standing behind him. But the memory of his eyes. There was something cold in them, something he had never seen before. Had the friendship, the shared struggle, the years of loyalty, had it all meant nothing? Was he just another pawn to be sacrificed for the prize of absolute power? Hours passed. The shooting stopped. The silence that returned was worse than before. It was the silence of a graveyard. Just after noon, he heard heavy, deliberate footsteps approaching his cell. The key turned in the lock. The bolt slid back with a loud clang. For a single foolish moment, hope flared in his chest. Adolf, he has come. But it wasn't Hitler. Two men in the black uniforms of the SS stood in the doorway. One was Theodor Eicke, the inspector of the concentration camps. The other was his adjutant, Michael Lippert, Their faces were blank, devoid of emotion. They looked at Röhm not as a man, but as a task to be completed. Heydrich spoke, his voice flat and bureaucratic. He said he had orders from the Führer, who was giving Röhm a chance to draw the consequences of his treason. He stepped forward and placed a single Browning pistol on the small wooden table in the center of the cell. Next to it, he laid a copy of the latest party newspaper. The headline screamed of a crushed plot. His plot. "You have 10 minutes to use this," Heydrich said, his eyes like chips of ice. 10 minutes to commit suicide, to die quietly and save Hitler the embarrassment of executing his oldest friend. It was the ultimate humiliation. He, Ernst Röhm, a decorated soldier of the Great War, was being told to take his own life like a disgraced clerk. Röhm looked from the pistol to the impassive faces of the SS officers. The last remnants of his faith in Adolf Hitler finally burned away, leaving only the ash of betrayal. A bitter laugh escaped his lips. He stood up, squaring his shoulders. He was a soldier. He would not die in a corner by his own hand. He stared directly at Heydrich. His voice was no longer pleading or confused. It was hard, defiant, and filled with the authority he had always possessed. "If I am to be killed," he boomed, the words echoing in the cell, "let Adolf do it himself." The SS men said nothing. They simply turned and walked out, locking the door behind them. The pistol remained on the table, a cold metallic promise. By refusing suicide, Röhm was making one last stand for his honor. He was trying to force his old friend to take personal responsibility for the murder he was about to commit. The 10-minute deadline was ticking away. Would Hitler grant him his final bitter wish and face him, man to man? Or would he have his oldest friend, the man who helped make him, murdered by proxy in a cold prison cell? The phone call lasted less than a minute. On one end of the line, Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS. On the other, in the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, Adolf Hitler. With a single word, Hitler ordered the execution of his oldest friend. In that same breath, he declared himself a man above any law. The murders had been chaotic, spread across Germany, but this final act required his personal approval. It was the keystone, the one death that would cement everything. Back in Munich, in Stadelheim prison, Ernst Röhm heard the sounds from the courtyard fade. The sporadic crack of rifles had finally fallen silent. His comrades, the leaders of the SA, were dead. He sat on the edge of his cot in the bare cell, still wearing the clothes he'd been arrested in. The initial disbelief had curdled into a bitter, simmering rage. This was Himmler's work. It had to be. A monstrous lie fed to a trusting Führer. Adolf would sort it out. Adolf would come for him. He had to. Their bond was forged in the streets, in prison cells, in the shared dream of a new Germany. It couldn't be broken by whispers and paper-thin conspiracies. The key turned in the lock. The heavy steel door grated open. 2 men in black SS uniforms stepped inside. One was Theodor Eicke, the inspector of concentration camps, a man who knew his trade. The other was his adjutant, Michael Lippert. Eicke held a pistol, but he didn't raise it. Instead, he placed it on the small table in the center of the cell. Beside it, he laid a single copy of the latest party newspaper. The headline screamed of treason, of a plot to overthrow the state. Röhm's plot. Eike's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. You have forfeited your life. The Führer gives you one last chance to draw the consequences. The meaning was clear. He was being offered the chance to take his own life. An honorable exit for a soldier. 10 minutes. That was the time they gave him. Then they turned, walked out, and locked the door behind them. Röhm stared at the pistol. He stared at the headline. The words were poison, a public declaration of his betrayal. He didn't touch the gun. His monumental, unshakable pride would not allow it. If he was to be killed, he would be killed. If I am to be shot, he shouted through the door, let Adolf do it himself. The minutes ticked by in the suffocating silence of the cell. 10 minutes passed, then 5 more. He must have known then, known that Adolf wasn't coming, that this wasn't a mistake. This was the plan. The lock turned again. Eike and Lippert re-entered the cell. Röhm stood up, facing them. He pulled his shirt open, baring his chest, a final act of defiance. A soldier facing a firing squad. According to one of the men, his last words were a choked cry, a plea and a curse all in one. My Führer, my Führer. The 2 SS officers raised their pistols. The shots echoed in the tiny space, brutally loud. Ernst Röhm, the man who built the SA, the man who put Hitler in power, fell to the stone floor. The revolution had finally eaten its own. Miles away, in Berlin, Hitler was preparing. The news of Röhm's death arrived by telephone. There was no visible reaction, no flicker of remorse, no sign of triumph. He was an actor, preparing for the most important role of his life. He stood before a mirror, adjusting his brown party uniform. He looked exhausted. The past 48 hours had been a blur of flights, arrests, and shouted orders, a sleepless marathon of violence. But beneath the fatigue, a new kind of certainty had taken root, a terrifying resolve. He had faced the abyss, stared into the face of betrayal, real or imagined, and he had not flinched. He had killed his brother. Now he had to explain why to the world. The Reichstag was convened on July 13, 1934, not in its traditional fire-damaged building, but in the Kroll Opera House. The members, all from the Nazi Party, filed in and took their seats beneath opulent chandeliers. The air was thick with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. They knew of the arrests. They had heard the rumors of executions. They had seen the newspaper headlines. But they didn't know the official story. They didn't know how their leader would frame a weekend of state-sanctioned murder. Hitler walked to the podium. He seemed calm, almost unnaturally so. He began to speak. His voice was not the usual hypnotic crescendo of a rally. It was hard, cold, and measured. He spoke of decay, of conspiracy, of a plot to plunge Germany back into chaos. He painted Rome and the SA leaders not as revolutionaries, but as degenerate traitors funded by foreign powers. He listed their supposed crimes, his voice dripping with moral outrage. The story was a fiction, but it was a compelling one. He was justifying the unthinkable. Then came the moment that would redefine Germany forever. He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. He looked out at the faces of the assembled politicians, judges, and party officials. He told them he had received panicked reports that a coup was imminent, that the nation was in mortal danger, that there was no time for courts, no time for trials. Action, swift and ruthless, was the only answer. And then the final, chilling declaration. "In this hour," he said, his voice ringing with absolute authority, "I was responsible for the fate of the German nation, and thereby I was the supreme judge of the German people." He didn't apologize. He didn't make excuses. He stood before the nation's lawmakers and admitted to ordering dozens of summary executions. He claimed the right to kill his citizens without trial, without appeal, based on his authority alone. In a single sentence, he had placed himself above the entire legal system. He had legalized murder. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence in the grand hall. The weight of his words settled over the room. And then something broke. One man began to clap, then another and another. Within seconds, the entire Reichstag was on its feet. The applause was not polite. It was thunderous, a roaring wave of approval, of relief, of adulation. They were cheering for the destruction of their own laws. They gave a standing ovation to a man who had just confessed to being a mass murderer. What does it say about a country when its lawmakers applaud the death of law itself? It says the country is lost. Hitler stood at the podium accepting the ovation, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. He had stared down his rivals. He had terrorized his enemies into silence. He had murdered his closest friend and been cheered for it. He had declared himself the law. But the game was not over. Two obstacles remained, two pillars of the old world. The aged, frail President Hindenburg, a man of the old Prussian aristocracy, was still alive, and the army, the institution he had made his bloody bargain with, was watching his every move. They had wanted Röhm gone, but had they created a monster they could no longer control? The German army got what they wanted. Ernst Röhm was dead. His stormtroopers were broken, their revolution silenced by the crack of an SS pistol. In return, the army gave Hitler something he wanted more than anything. They gave him themselves. It was the most catastrophic bargain in military history. The gunfire had stopped. A strange, heavy quiet fell over Germany. In the first days of July 1934, the official narrative was simple, broadcast on every radio station and printed in every newspaper. A traitorous plot had been brewing. Röhm and his cronies were planning to overthrow the state. The Führer, acting with decisive speed, had saved the nation from civil war. It was a clean, necessary surgery. But whispers traveled faster than newspapers. Whispers of men dragged from their homes in the middle of the night, of shots fired in the forests outside Berlin, of wives who were told their husbands had died resisting arrest or had taken their own lives in shame. The official death toll was 77. The real number was likely 3 times that, maybe more. No one knew for sure. The truth was buried in shallow graves and burned in secret files. On July 13th, Hitler faced the Reichstag. He didn't look like a man who had just ordered the murder of his oldest friend. He looked exhausted, burdened. He spoke for 2 hours, his voice rising from a somber justification to a furious roar. He laid out the supposed evidence of Röhm's treason, painting a picture of moral decay and looming chaos. And then he said the words that redefined the very concept of law in Germany. He declared that in that moment of national peril, he alone had been responsible. He was the supreme judge of the German people. Think about what that means. Not a court, not a trial, one man. He was judge, jury, and executioner. He had placed himself above the law, and the nation's parliament rose to their feet and gave him a standing ovation. In the wood-paneled halls of the Defense Ministry, there was a collective sigh of relief. The generals, men like Werner von Blomberg, had won. The SA, their vulgar, undisciplined rival, was gone. The army was once again the sole bearer of arms in Germany. They had made a deal with this strange, intense politician, and he had delivered. They saw him as a tool, a useful instrument to restore order and begin rearmament. They believed they were the masters of the game. They believed they had Hitler on a leash. But one final piece remained on the board, the last vestige of the old order, President Paul von Hindenburg. The 86-year-old field marshal was a living monument to a Germany that no longer existed. He was frail, his mind was fading, but he was still the head of state. He was the only man Hitler still showed deference to, the only authority he could not simply dismiss. And Hindenburg was dying. In early August, the news came from his country estate. The president's life was ending. Hitler didn't wait for the official announcement. He moved with the same speed he had used to launch the purge. The moment Hindenburg drew his last breath, a new law, prepared in advance, was enacted. The office of president was merged with the office of chancellor. There would be no election, no successor. There would only be one leader. The title was new, Führer and Reich Chancellor. Hitler now had total political power, but he needed something more, something deeper than laws and titles. He needed the soul of the nation's military, and the generals, so pleased with their recent victory, were eager to give it to him. Defense Minister von Blomberg, a man nicknamed the Rubber Lion for his willingness to bend to Hitler's will, saw an opportunity to prove the army's loyalty once and for all. He proposed a change to the military oath. For centuries, German soldiers swore allegiance to the people and the fatherland. They swore to uphold the Constitution. It was an oath to an idea, to the state itself. Blomberg drafted a new one. It was short, direct, and absolute. And it was not to a constitution, a flag, or a country. It was to a man. On August 2nd, 1934, across every barracks and military base in Germany, soldiers were assembled. They raised their right hands, and they spoke the new words. I swear by God this sacred oath that I will render unconditional obedience to the Führer of the German Reich and people, Adolf Hitler, the supreme commander of the armed forces, and that I am willing as a brave soldier to lay down my life at any time for this oath. Unconditional obedience, not to Germany, to Adolf Hitler. The generals celebrated. They had their discipline back. They had a leader who promised to rebuild their army into the greatest fighting force in the world. They had removed their rivals and secured their place at the center of power. What they failed to understand was the nature of the trap they had just set for themselves. They had sworn away their right to question, their right to refuse an illegal order, their right to serve the nation over the whims of a single man. They had transformed themselves from the guardians of the state into the personal instrument of the Führer. They had traded their moral compass for a promise of new divisions and new tanks. Historians often point to this moment, this oath of blood sworn in the shadow of a bloody purge. They call it the point of no return for Germany, the moment when the institution that could have stopped Hitler voluntarily shackled itself to his will. Was this the final lock clicking into place? Consider Hitler's position now. He was head of state, head of government, and head of the party, and by a sacred holy oath, he was the personal master of every soldier and sailor in the land. Röhm was gone. The SA was a ghost. His political rivals were dead, imprisoned, or in exile. The army was bound to him not by law, but by a promise made to God. The board was clear. Every opposing piece had been swept away. He was the undisputed Führer, commander of the army, and supreme judge, all in one. With no one left to stop him, what would he do next? 10 years after the Night of the Long Knives, the men who helped Hitler murder his friend found themselves in their own prison cells. They had made a deal with the devil, and the devil had come to collect. The blood debt of 1934 was about to be paid in full with interest. The system they had built to hunt others was now turning on them with perfect, cold efficiency. First, there was Heinrich Himmler, the loyal Heinrich, the meticulous architect of the purge, the man who had drawn up the death lists and organized the firing squads. By April of 1945, with the Russian army shelling Berlin, Himmler was living in a fantasy world. As the Third Reich crumbled into dust and ash around him, he imagined a new role for himself, the savior of Germany. He met secretly with Count Folke Bernadotte of the Swedish Red Cross. In a castle near the Baltic coast, surrounded by the ghosts of his own empire, Himmler made his pathetic plea. He, the chief of the Gestapo and the SS, the overseer of the concentration camps, offered to surrender all German forces in the West to the Allies. He truly believed they would see him as a reasonable man, a partner for peace. Bernadotte listened, a mask of diplomatic calm hiding his revulsion. The Allies, of course, ignored the offer completely. The only name they wanted from him was on an indictment for war crimes. When the final surrender came, Himmler was a man on the run. He shaved his infamous mustache, put a black patch over one eye, and took on the identity of a discharged soldier named Heinrich Hitzinger. But his face was too well known. His pursuers were everywhere. He was captured not in a dramatic final stand, but at a routine British checkpoint. The man who had controlled the lives and deaths of millions was brought down by a few suspicious soldiers on a lonely country road. They took him to an interrogation center in Lüneburg. The room was bare. A simple wooden table, 2 chairs. The British officers who faced him struggled to reconcile the monster of their imagination with the meek, bespectacled man sitting before them. They ordered a doctor to inspect him for hidden poison. The doctor told him to open his mouth. For a moment, Himmler hesitated. Then, with a sudden, sharp movement, he bit down. The crunch of glass was unmistakable, a cyanide capsule. He slumped to the floor, his body racked with brief, violent convulsions. Within minutes, the Reichsführer SS was dead on a dusty floor, a pathetic end for the man who believed he was destined to build a new Aryan dynasty. Then there was Hermann Göring, Hitler's designated successor, the flamboyant commander of the Luftwaffe, the man who had unleashed his personal police force in Berlin during the Purge. At the Nuremberg trials, he was prisoner number 1. and for a time he played the part of the defiant star. He was arrogant, witty, charming even. He sparred with the chief prosecutor, Robert Jackson, treating the trial as a final grand performance. He saw himself as a historical figure, defending his legacy before the world. He would wink at his guards, try to rally the other defendants, convinced he could still dominate any room he was in. But then came the films. The prosecutors dimmed the lights in the courtroom and played the footage their own signal corps had taken upon liberating the concentration camps. The images flickered across the screen. Skeletal figures in striped pajamas, staring with hollow eyes, bulldozers pushing mountains of emaciated corpses into mass graves. The silent, accusing faces of the dead, filmed in stark, unforgiving black and white. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Some defendants wept openly, others stared at the floor, unable to watch. Göring's bravado finally shattered. He ripped off his headphones, his face pale. He couldn't watch. He couldn't face the reality of the system he had so eagerly helped create. The man who boasted of his power was broken by the simple, undeniable truth on a movie screen. The verdict was inevitable. Guilty on all counts. Sentence, death by hanging. But Göring would have one last act of defiance. On the night before his scheduled execution, he penned a final self-pitying note. He would not allow his enemies the satisfaction of hanging him like a common criminal. He, too, bit down on a hidden vial of cyanide. The man who had helped Hitler murder his rivals in their beds died alone in his cell, cheating the hangman by a mere 2 hours. And what of the army? The generals had made their own fateful pact in 1934. They had traded Röhm's head for the promise of rearmament and the preservation of their own power. For 10 years, that bargain held. But the seeds of betrayal, once planted, grow in poisoned soil. By 1944, many of those same generals saw that Hitler was leading Germany into absolute ruin. They planned their own purge. The July 20th plot, a bomb in a briefcase meant to kill the Führer and end the war. The bomb exploded, but Hitler survived, and his vengeance was swift and terrible. Among the hundreds arrested was Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, a man who had known about and approved of the 1934 purge. Now he found himself facing Hitler's court, not a court of law, but a theater of humiliation. The judge was Roland Freisler, a screeching, fanatical sadist. Witzleben, an old Prussian field marshal, was stripped of his belt and suspenders before the trial. He was forced to stand before the court, clutching his oversized trousers to keep them from falling down. Freisler screamed at him, his voice cracking with fury. "You dirty old man! Why do you keep fiddling with your trousers?" Witzleben tried to answer, but Freisler just shrieked over him. "In what pigsty were you raised that you behave so shamefully in front of a court?" His fate was sealed. He was taken to Plötzensee prison in Berlin. His execution was not a soldier's death by firing squad. It was a butcher's work. The execution chamber was a stark white room. Hanging from a steel rail along the ceiling was a series of large, sharp meat hooks. Witzleben and the other condemned men were stripped to the waist. Thin nooses of piano wire were placed around their necks. Then they were hoisted up, their feet kicking in the air, strangling slowly and agonizingly, and on Hitler's direct orders, a camera crew filmed every second of their horrific deaths. The footage was flown to his headquarters. He wanted to watch the men who betrayed him die. The very system of extrajudicial murder the Army had sanctioned in 1934 had come full circle to claim them. In the end, the Night of the Long Knives wasn't just the murder of rivals. It was the murder of the Nazi Party's own past. It destroyed the last vestige of the old street-fighting camaraderie, the last man who could speak to Hitler as an equal. What remained was not a political movement, but the singular, destructive will of one man. The oath of personal, unconditional loyalty the Army swore to Hitler after the Purge was the chain that bound them to him. It paralyzed their will to act for years, trapping them in a bargain that led directly to the meat hooks at Plötzensee. In a quiet cemetery in Munich lies the simple grave of Ernst Röhm, the friend Hitler sacrificed for absolute power. That broken friendship was the foundation stone of the Third Reich, and the paranoia and betrayal born on that bloody weekend in 1934 would haunt its leader to the very end, culminating in a storm of fire and death in a Berlin bunker. He had built his Reich on a foundation of broken loyalty. In doing so, he planted the seeds of the paranoia that would guarantee his own downfall.